off a minute 41-second lap, which is 101 seconds, the OEM oil pan actually spent 16 seconds, so roughly 16% of that time below the 30% threshold, whereas ours have basically reduced it down to 0 at this point.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Driver's Paddock. Today I'm joined by Kevin, Wong, and Ping. And last time the three of us met together, we talked about the current state of oil starvation in the Gen 2 BRZ and GR86, so the FA24 motor. Just a quick recap, Kevin is a specialist in fluid dynamics. He works with pumps, he does a lot of HVAC stuff. He has a really big understanding in sort of what is going on in the pump in the GR86, which is a positive displacement pump. Ping here is an automotive engineer. He has done a lot of Formula SAE, and he is, the two of them, of course, automotive enthusiasts. And so the two of them teamed up to sort of do a deep dive in terms of what is going on with oil starvation in these cars. And so we have an in-depth video that covers all of that. I picked these two guys' brains for about an hour. And so if you want to learn all about that, please go check out that video. In that video, when we did some testing with Kevin's car, I was actually able to get the car down to 29 PSI sustained. We'll show some of the footage of that later on, but this video will cover some new exciting developments and the solution that these two have come up with, along with our data engineer who's off camera now, and they've worked tirelessly to come to this point. And so, Ping, can you give us a brief synopsis of what the real issue is? What is the big picture?
Yeah. So even from the FA20 development papers you can find online, Subaru published this. They knew oil starvation and oil being stuck in the heads of the flat engine was an issue. When it came to the FA24, there was not much change made internally for the engine, but the oil capacity was reduced. There were some minor differences in terms of the pickup and the oil pan, but overall it became a bigger issue with the FA24 to the point that people are blowing them up way more often on track than the FA20. FA20 with overfill, maybe some baffling, and an oil cooler seems to survive quite well on track, but that is not true for the FA24. So now we are looking at solutions. When we did a deeper dive into what is happening in the engine, the oil pan's just too small for the capacity, or it just doesn't have enough capacity in the oil pan to continuously pump oil into the heads of this motor, but not have a return during a high G corner and a sustained long high G corner. So a combination of higher capacity and baffling is needed here. Their aftermarket have been coming up with solutions which purely baffles, and that helps with the initial sloshing. But towards the end of a corner, a sustained long right-hand corner, you will still run out of oil on a stock oil pan. So what we come up with is within the OEM volume, not cutting up any heat shields, retaining all OEM components, we are able to fit a way larger oil pan with a baffle system, a traditional baffle system inside, and that seems to have mitigated a lot of the issues. And we're going to talk about the data and whatnot in a bit. But yeah, so we'll show diagrams as well. There's a specific one that came to mind when I was reading the FA20 development paper, where they show an improvement, a purpose improvement in oil starvation in left-hand turns. They discuss the roping effect of the timing chain and how, because of the fact that the timing chain travels in direction towards the center of the engine, the roping effect actually helps pull some of the oil that's stuck in the timing cover back into the center, and then eventually returning into the sump. This feature, this oil rib that they're talking about in the paper, seems to be helpful because you don't quite see pressure drops on left-hand turns. Seems to be an exclusively to right-hand turns. There's obviously asymmetries with the engine, and you can't have both left and right be perfect, but it seems to be especially a problem in right-hand turns. And we wonder if this contributes significantly. So this is kind of interesting development. We think that it doesn't take a lot. We're on the verge maybe of the oil pan working, and you don't need to reduce the pressure drop by too much to make the engine last. Speaking of which, we've been, both Kevin and I, whenever we are doing oil changes, after all these testing, have been sending in oil analysis reports, and to date, even with a couple of low 30 PSI pressure we see, and the lowest of 29 PSI, the oil report has come back perfectly clean. We're obviously changing oil way more frequently. So the oil quality and degradation is not really a problem. It's more so trying to see whether there are any other metallic or other engine material within this oil. And to date, it's been very good. So we think we're getting very close to a solution. We're looking at potentially making a product out of this.
So the issues, if put simply, is that the oil is getting stuck in the heads, and the oil is also sloshing, right?
Yes.
So the lack of volume of oil at the level of the pickup is really the issue, right? I know Kevin talked about positive displacement pumps, which is the oil pump in the FA24 motor. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Kevin, what a positive displacement pump is like and the linearity of sort of how it produces oil pressure?
Yeah, so the thing with a positive displacement pump is basically a gear, and each gear has certain voids in it. Between the teeth of the gear has voids, and it's basically spinning around inside a fixed volume space. So it's positive displacement because you take a certain amount of volume displacement and you're pushing it out, right? Unlike for example, if you look at a centrifugal pump, it spins an impeller that kind of whips the water to move it out. There's a lot of gaps between the impeller and the actual casing itself, whereas positive displacement is very tight usually. And actually that's something that Ping and I also picked up in the manual. They talk about having a two-stage relief system, and that's why it's there, because if you, for whatever reason, if you block the discharge of the pump, you will cause damage to that gear, because for most part the oil is relatively incompressible, right? So that's why, like, with positive displacement pumps, they're great for an application like an engine where if I go up in RPM, I need to have that pick up an extra oil. So their pump curves, which is basically a flow rate versus pressure curve, that's very linear, so it's very predictable. If I go up by 1,000 RPM, it'll go up by this relationship, right? That's very easy to predict. Whereas if you look at a centrifugal pump, their curves are very round, so you kind of have to figure, okay, is my resistance going to change? Is your flow rate doesn't exponentially go up or linearly go up with your increase in RPM, which makes it harder for someone trying to design an engine to calculate whether it'll get enough oil flow, right? So
really the issue is at the level of the pickup. Then it's not getting oil to that pump and then to the rest of the engine, right?
That's right. That's right. And one thing we wanted to mention is that this oil pump has a two-stage pressure relief. When you're looking through the menu, service menu, they talk about the pumping rate of this pump as well as the two pressure bleed-offs. And that's why it's producing this curvature. The first 3,000 RPM or so looks very linear, and then at some point some kind of pressure relief system gets activated, and towards the last 3,000 to 7,000 or 4,000 to 7,000 RPM range, it's relatively flat with a slight curvature down towards that red line.
I see.
And then one thing we wanted to mention is that there are specs for this pump in the service menu. This thing at 6,000 RPM is pumping 46 liters of oil per minute, okay? The entire capacity of the engine is somewhere around 6
5.9.
Yeah, 5.9 liters. So 6 liters if you over 6 point something if you overfill. The entirety of the oil system is fully cycled through in about 7-8 seconds when you're operating at 6,000 RPM. So when you think about it, towards 7,000 RPM or 7,400 when you're at red line, this thing is evacuating oil pretty much every 6 to 7 seconds. The entire 6 liters is going to have to go through the engine, and that's why towards the end of a corner, or people that are talking about downshifting, or not downshifting, but upshifting early to reduce the RPM does help with the amount of oil that's being drawn out of the sun.
Yeah, that's strictly mitigating. You're pumping less, basically.
Yeah.
That's why if you pump at a lower flow rate, therefore you'll have more oil. Or you should have the higher odds of more oil in the pan.
Yeah.
That's why it works.
Right. So we've already hinted a little bit at it. So do we have a solution at this point?
Yes. We have a working prototype on Kevin's car. We just recently went back to the track. You were the driver of that vehicle. We laid down some pretty impressive times for a mostly stock vehicle with just tires, brakes, and track alignment. We're pretty comfortable with what we're seeing right now, and that's where the product part comes in. We think it's going to be the solution here. We think this bigger oil pan with baffles is going to help a lot of owners be more comfortable tracking their vehicles, taking not as extreme oil grades to make it not blow up on track, and be able to enjoy the vehicle more.
Or even just further modify them, right? Aero, sticky 200 treader air, coilovers, that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
You put a lot more G's with modifications like that. But Kevin, can you talk a little bit about the first time we went out to Canadian Tire Motorsports Park Grand Prix track? What modifications were on the car at that time?
So the very first time in your original video, you basically had stock everything except for the pads, which was the G-Lock R16's front and back. The oil was Motul XS 5W30, and basically the brake fluid was basically endless RF 650. So your standard, basically go to the track, upgrade your brake fluid, upgrade your pads, and upgrade your I went up with 530 knowing about the oil issues, and I had a slight overfill. So yeah, at that point, yeah, it was stock everything else. No alignment, stock tires. Gave the keys to Jason, and yeah, that's when we saw 29 psi.
Yeah, so even with the stock setup, stock tires, right, with the 500 milliliter overfill, we saw as low as a 29 psi sustained, right? And so that's a real problem. And so do we have some good reliable data to present to the audience to see if the oil pan that you guys have created is actually helping?
Yeah, we got a lot of data actually, but we're picking out a couple of cases to showcase the solution that we come up with. So the very first one that we want to maybe showcase is the stock that, like we was just mentioned, the very first time we went out on track with the OEM oil pan, and our working prototype, which also has a track alignment attached to it because we were swapping tires to the more sticky 200 treadwear rating later on to do more testing.
Yeah, in order to fit the rims, we needed that alignment. But I mean, of course, it is performance enhancing, right?
So if anything, the data set with the prototype oil pan was similar times, but it was generating more G's in the corners. We basically saw no oil pressure drop past the 30% threshold. And just want to get into a little bit of the story here, why we picked 30%. In literature, there's been a couple cited papers about engineers doing testing on how much oil pressure drop is an acceptable amount before damage to engine components happen. There's not a generally accepted rule, but because it's every case by case dependent. But they do mention Once you start seeing 40% aeration, which you can kind of equate to 40% pressure drops, you start getting localized heating and localized issues where components start touching each other. This is of course oil grade, oil additive, and all sorts of other parameter variable setup, right? So we're choosing 30% to give us ourselves a bit more margin, and that is also where we set our target, that if we can achieve 30%, less than 30% pressure drop, then we think that should mitigate most issues, if not all the issues that you're seeing. Even on an OEM setup, you're seeing 40+% pressure drop with stock tires. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So now up on the screen we have the configuration A versus the configuration E. So A is again the stock car with a 500 miller overfill. The configuration E is the one with the alignment, but with their solution. And can you just talk the audience a little bit, sort of what we're looking at here?
Yeah. So I can kind of show where we highlighted some gray regions where we're looking at the lighter blue color for oil pressure, relative oil pressure drop. And when we highlight the gray boxes are areas of the curve where it's below 30% relative oil pressure drop. And then, of course, you can see the darker blue line is it's the same car with the prototype oil pan, and you can see that it's pretty much flat everywhere except for one or two spots where we're seeing very minor and very quickly returning pressures. And there's a slight dip. There's a very slight dip towards the end of turn 8. When you take a look at this graph and look at the amount of time that we're no longer spending under the 30% threshold, it's pretty much a 99% reduction in that time frame. We saw a very brief moment of 0.04 seconds where it actually dipped below the 30%, but the rest of the data compared to the OEM setup is a significant improvement. When you off a minute 41 second lap, which is 101 seconds, the OEM oil pan actually spent 16 seconds, so roughly 16% of that time below the 30% threshold, whereas ours have basically reduced it down to 0 at this point. Yeah, so there's some worrying and or concerning things that we're seeing with the OEM oil pan. Some of the highlights is that going down the back straight of CTMP, there's actually less pressure than ideal. You are going up a hill, going straight, and the pressure never really returns to the reference with the OEM oil pan. And we basically solved that with the prototype, and for the stock grip levels, you should have no problems with this oil pan. So, which brings us, kind of to the next one, which is what happens when you start slapping sticky tires and further modifications to this vehicle. All right, Jason, you're the driver of the vehicle. On the very last test day, you really drove the wheels off of this thing. We have a recorded lap of 136.3, but all day you were talking about that 35. And we saw it in the optimal. We know the car is capable. You just had to string it together. Can you talk about the driving and how this car feels, and just the driving impressions of the vehicle?
Yeah, no, of course, the car is amazing, and I absolutely love the track. Canadian Tire Motorsports Park Grand Prix track, former F1 track, huge elevation changes, long sweepers, you're pulling a lot of Gs. It's really a thrill, right? And with the BRZ being able to carry so much speed, and with the 200 treader tires being able to pull so much Gs, it's quite the experience, right? It can really put down the power, not having that much power. So you can get the throttle really early here. and there's a lot of time on full throttle, and so big commitment track for sure, right? In many areas, like it's four-wheel sliding, it's a whole lot of fun. But the car is great for sure. But yeah, pulling a lot of G's. Why don't we take a look at that 136.3? And another time, I'll definitely head back for that 135.
So we go to configuration A versus D. This is where we put on 200 treadwear rating tires, the Nankang CRS, in a 245/40/17 on a Apex wheel that's 17 by 9. This is what we consider a enthusiast setup. You're going to be a little bit more serious about your times at the track. Maybe you bring a set of wheels with you to the track and some tools to change them. This should be producing near the peak, like near the maximum grip levels that you should be seeing out there, without going to some kind of slick option. We haven't done that testing, of course, but if you are very serious about your tracking and you are generating even more lateral grip than the 200 treadwear rating tires can offer, then we would love to talk to you and see if you can want to do some testing with us. But when we did this configuration, Jason drove from an OEM setup of 141 seconds to 136, which is a huge improvement. This is like a 5-second improvement on the lap time. But when you look at the data, we are still significantly better than what stock can do. We reduced, the majority of the drops are less area under the curve, so significant improvement in the time that the engine actually spends less than the 30% pressure. And then, of course, the peaks or the valleys in this case are also reduced. So we reduced the absolute pressure drop as well, to the point that we think we're comfortable with this. And there's some little bit more improvements that we made from this prototype to a potential production version that should mitigate some of these extra low drops even further. So with the combination of knowing that the solution works and some additional improvements, we think this will be the ideal setup basically for somebody running the car in a similar situation. There's potential of going up to 255 tires, which would help in the corners, but would slow you down a little bit in the straights. And potentially people running to 65s, where you start cutting up the chassis to make them fit. But we haven't seen too many super serious time attackers or lappers that's running to 65 tires on this platform yet. But of course, people with coilovers, aero, engine mods, and more serious grip setups, please talk to us. We would love to try this on your car.
So Ping, previously you talked about the time under starvation between the stock vehicle and the one with your pan. Can you talk a little bit about time under starvation between stock and the Nankangs?
Yeah. So sorry, I missed that. But when we looked at the time that the oil pressure was spent under 30%, so anything greater than 30%, we came up with a number of 0.18 seconds. That's how much time that the oil pressure actually dipped below 30% oil pressure drop. But when you look at the graph here, you can kind of see the majority of the time we are recovering right away. The amount of area that is spent underneath or time that is spent underneath this threshold is pretty much a blink of an eye at this point. We don't think it's a significant issue anymore. When you compare it with the OEM, we're seeing a 98.9% reduction in time spent under 30%. It's not 99.9% like the OEM versus OEM because of the added grip levels. This is now a 98.9% reduction. So 99% reduction of time spent under 30%.
And Kevin, not to put you on the spot, but given the understanding of the positive displacement pump, how much volume is that in such a short period of time?
I just did the quick math. Funny you asked me that. So if it was 0.19 seconds, you're basically, so I'm comparing the peak flow rate, so the 49 liters per minute, and then comparing that against the 0.19. So we said we were less than 70%. So I just went with an extra conservative number, say 65%. You're looking at a difference between 155 mils if everything was perfectly good, and 65% of that is 100 mils. So you're making up for that 55 mil difference.
Yeah.
So we're talking mils at this point, right?
Yeah.
And we're not talking like again
multiple liters.
Yeah, in the liters range, right? We're talking about a tenth of a liter, right? So it's like it's nothing.
And it'll recover basically right away, right?
And the key thing is, like you mentioned at the beginning of the video too, like we sent, so that oil sample we sent out to the analysis, right? That had Shannonville, that had TMP, and then DDT, and then the GP date, the first GP date after the first video. So yeah, and that oil sample went out. So it's not just a quickly change, put in fresh oil, quickly take it out for sampling and analysis. It went through multiple track days and street driving, and it came back very clean.
Yeah.
So like basically it was non-detectable. Nobody knew, like someone looking at that would say there's no there's literally no metals.
Yeah.
We can
maybe share the report. You can overlay it over the screen. Pretty much it's zeros across the board. I mean, when you look at this is as clean as oil can be at this point. Yeah.
So Kevin, Ping, you guys talk a lot about oil pressure. What about oil temperature?
Yeah. So back when we did the initial testing, the oil temperature got up to 130 C. That's in the 260 something F range, which is very hot. It's within the acceptable range of the oil, but anybody that does tracking knows that this is this setup needs cooling. The lap that we did in with the prototype oil pan was a little bit cooler, simply because the day was a little bit cooler. The ambient air temperature was a little bit cooler that day, and it was on a first or second lap, not the third or fourth lap that you set your best time, which helped with a little bit about the temperature. So if your car has oil cooler, where you're able to stabilize the oil temperature even further, your reference oil pressure would be higher. And these drops will actually, in terms of relative percentages, will look better as well. So Kevin's car with an oil cooler could look even better. The data would make the data look even better than this. And that is definitely an area of opportunity. We see lots of air to oil cooler kits out there. There are lots of options on the market. There's lots of information about people trying out homebrew solutions, which may actually be better if you're using the correct fittings with the right internal diameters and whatnot. The name of the game here is to reduce any restriction within the oil cooling setup. OEM, of course, does a great job because it's just pass through. It just passes through. There's not additional flow passages and whatnot. But this is a separate topic altogether. We need to do a deep dive there. But the downfall of the OEM is that there's simply not enough cooling capacity. Just the area of the cooler and the amount of coolant that's actually flowing through there, the delta temperatures between the coolant and the oil is just not enough.
Yeah, and it doesn't spend a lot of time. Like in HVAC applications, we talk about residence time. It's literally just shooting right through.
Yeah.
So it does not spend a lot of time actually interfacing thermally with the coolant.
Yeah.
Which is also running hot.
Yeah. The benefit of it is that on a warm-up cycle, you're using the coolant to actually heat up the oil. That's the one benefit of the OEM setup. Ideally, potentially a future product or something, but a larger water to oil cooler close to the OEM location or very short routing to the OEM location would be an even better option, because people that are running track setups, if you're daily driving, you may actually want to block off a portion of your oil cooler so that your oil actually gets the temperature. It is doing a great job on track, but then those daily commutes or short drives that you're doing, your oil's not coming up to temp.
So with that being said, why do we run 5W30 rather than heavier weight oil?
Yeah, so that's another great question. When you look at the two-stage oil pump, two-stage pressure relief system of the oil pump, the cutoff pressure is in I think it's about 101 psi. Yeah. So that's when the main opening of this of the relief valve is at full, pretty much at full opening. Even with a 5W30 oil on cold startups, we're seeing over 100 psi. So we know we're definitely working that pressure relief system. You can go higher in terms of viscosity, and that's going to raise your relative baseline oil pressure. But once it starts dropping, the relative percentage drop is still quite large, even with a heavier weight. But you are reducing the absolute value of the pressure at the bottom of those pressure drops. So lots of people in hotter climates and or dedicated track cars, we've seen guys run 50 weight oil on their dedicated track cars. And it's kind of interesting because you're seeing 80 plus PSI just driving around the paddock, or 100 plus PSI when it's a cold startup, which we don't think it's necessary, and it's more so of a band-aid solution to deal with the pressure drops and engine protection in these extreme events. We think if you can reduce the pressure drops to the point that is no longer a problem, you can get away with a more reasonable oil that does not deviate too much from OEM.
That's one thing I want to point out too. Like if you look at the manual, 0W20 is what they say you should put in. 5W30 is allowed, but they tell you go back to 0W20. Now there's all sorts of reasons why Subaru will want you to go with the 0W20, emissions related, fuel efficiency. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's not performance driving related. But at the same time, if 5W30 can be run, we should. That's kind of why we stuck with that parameter basis too, because the engine tolerances, all that stuff is like it's a good. Basically, the engineers have done their homework to say this will kind of cover your butt in most situations. So if you start going with a 0W50, like we know some people have, or when you start up cold, are you sure you're getting the right flow? And that's the thing. People are so when people talk about pumps, they over focus on pressure. Pressure is a side product of flow in a restricted system, right? I don't care what pressure I get, do I get the flow? And the key thing is, okay, conversely, if you run basically 0W0, right? It's super runny, it flows like crazy, but will you actually maintain a film thickness between the moving parts, right? Any tribologist will tell you, like, okay, great, I need to maintain a proper lubrication layer between the two metals. And if you run something super thin, you'll get tons of flow, but it won't maintain it long enough to actually hold up a shield to basically the wear. If you run too thick, you're also running the issue where, is it really getting to the tight passages? That's why weights matter.
Yeah. Yeah, and then of course, if you're seeing super high temperatures, people's reaction is a lot of times just to up the weight. Effectively, you have a similar thickness oil at those higher temperatures than a lower weight oil at a lower temperature. But in this case, if we introduce cooling to this current setup, I think a 5W30 would be more than sufficient. And 5W30 is actually perfectly fine. And if you look at the service manual, it is not recommended for the BRZ in North America, but in Japan they have a STI grade 5W30 that people are running, and in other countries 5W30 is part of the service manual, and 5W30 is also part of the service manual for the WRX, which is a turbocharged F824, but but you know, like this engine is not significantly different than the WRX, short of compression and turbo, and some other parts, but tolerances should not be significantly different.
And also curious too, like for those people running 0W50 oils, are you doing oil analysis?
Yeah, you might actually get more damage on cold startups than during your track driving. This is a whole different topic and nuanced topic, but if you're daily driving your vehicle, running a 50 weight oil is probably not recommended. Even a 40 weight might be on the high side, but we can't say for sure without looking at the data. But there's lots of talk about 040. 040 is actually kind of interesting. Some of the 040s, like the Mobil 1 full synthetic, is on the thinner end of a 40 weight oil and on the very thick end of a 30 weight oil. So maybe there's some compromises that you can make here with a cooler, with other an extra capacity. Maybe you don't even need to run a 40 weight oil.
So with the data, I'm sure everybody is wondering how long until production, how can you get one, and what are some of the features of this mysterious pan?
Yeah. So we'll be releasing more information on this for sure, but some of the information that we can share now is that it's going to be a cast aluminum oil pan, a significantly larger volume than OEM. We are still within all OEM components will be fitted under, would be able to fit with this pan. We added some provisions for oil returns and potentially areas that you can add ports on, but those are more quality of life improvements. But it fits with OEM headers, with OEM heat shields, no cutting of OEM heat shields, OEM engine mounts, OEM pretty much every skid plate, all of that will be on there. It has a baffle system, like I said, inside, and significantly more volume. Okay. We are looking at the cast aluminum option because of the intricate shape that it's taken on to take advantage of the OEM volume here. It will also be relatively affordable versus a machined or billet pan. There's some on the market that is pretty big and over $1,000, we definitely want to keep the cost well under that, so that you're not spending way too much money on solving something that should have been solved by the OEM. The next thing is the production timeline. We have started contacting a lot of manufacturers, both local and international, on what it would cost for us to produce something and then get it all quality tested and brought back over to North America. So the pricing and whatnot is still TBD, but the initial conversations has been very promising, and there are lots of places that could make a product like this. In terms of timeline, we're looking at 2 to 3 months before we can get some kind of production sample, which kind of leads into the Christmas and New Year's time frame. We will likely release more information, probably in the form of some kind of group buy, or Kickstarter or Indiegogo or something along those lines to get this initial batch started. There are some minimum order quantities that we need to hit, otherwise it wouldn't really make financial sense. So yeah, keep in touch and keep checking back at the channel and our content. We will be making release announcements coming up soon.
And one thing too, when I was posting, talking about this on some of the forums, a lot of people were asking, well, what is this header or this axle header? The key thing is to remember, if that header did not protrude into the heat shield, it'll work with this pan.
Yeah.
Right. So if you didn't have to get a custom pan to fit in that header, it has a good chance to work. And if it doesn't penetrate into the heat shield, it definitely will work.
Yeah.
So that's the key. That's the key thing, right? There's no ifs, ands, or buts around that.
Yeah. So the OEM header is quite restrictive in terms of space. That was our goal, to make sure that you did not need to modify anything. If you are using some of the headers that starts deviating significantly from the stock volume, we don't want to guarantee that it'll fit, but if you have any 3D scans or any headers, popular ones that you can provide some kind of digitization for us, we can definitely check for clearances. But the very first thing that we want to say is that it will fit the OEM header, and any header that does not protrude out of the OEM header spacing. You can, especially towards the oil pan. If it's away from the oil pan, then it's definitely going to work. And this is another piece of the puzzle that we need to consider, which is, does it fit multiple aftermarket headers and whatnot? So yeah, if you have something that's popular, I know JDL is like a pretty popular unequal length headers amongst the community. We don't have any JDL headers on hand to check fitment, but if you have CAD or 3D scans, please let us know. We would love to check fitment and see whether it would work for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If you want to get in contact with Kevin with Ping, please comment in the comment section below, or follow Ping at Formula Delta.
Yeah. So we'll put it on
Instagram.
Screen,
Yeah.
Formula Delta on Instagram, or if you would like to message us on Facebook, that's also fine. We'll attach all the social handles in the edit.
Yeah.
But yeah. So please reach out. We actually, after the release of the first video, we did get a couple people reaching out asking how they can help, and coming up with ideas and suggestions and just general interest from the community. It's always nice to have those interactions, so please feel free to reach out to us.
Mm-hmm.